Okay, I think I see some people filtering in. If there's someone who is watching right now and could confirm for me in the chat that I can actually be heard, that would be lovely. Okay, awesome. Gonna give it 2 or 3 minutes just for people to hop in. We will get started pretty shortly. I don't want to keep things going too long, but I'll give it 2 to 3 minutes before we get things started. Okay, fantastic. Let's get started. So welcome everyone. Today, going to be running a seminar on sports debates titled Sports Debates Are Not Low Impact. This is where I'll try to convince many of you who I'm sure are skeptical that indeed sports debates are both relevant, impactful, and have many great opportunities for good argumentation, good comparative, all those kinds of things. But I also want to make sure in this seminar that I'm giving people an idea of how it is they can approach sports debates, what it is that you broadly need to know, and some differentiation about the different kinds of sports debates that exist. So in terms of some structural things here, I'm going to be going through some of the main points that I have in the seminar. I'll go through some of that in a second. I would ask if you have questions or if there's things you want me to answer. We're going to do a question and answer period near the end. This will probably, including question and answers, go no longer than an hour. I'll try to keep it even shorter than that. I know nobody wants to hear me blabber on for too long. The other thing that I should mention just in terms of the structure, I have broadly 8 things that I wanted to talk about. There's obviously a chance that I don't get to everything that I want to discuss, but of the broad 8 things that I'm going to be touching on today, first, I'm going to talk about the purpose of sports broadly. Second, I'm going to talk about what's useful to know for when you are debating sports rounds. Third, I'm going to categorize sports debates insofar as that's even possible. You'll see we'll run into some difficulty when we get to that section. Fourth, I'm going to talk about where sports as a cultural entity tend to succeed most. Sixth, where they fail most. Seventh, I'm going to talk about some specific athletes and specific examples that I think are useful to know about. And then eighth, I'm going to talk about some major sports controversies, the things that you're likely to see coming up in debate rounds. Now, again, whether or not I get to all these things, time will tell on that, but I will endeavor to try to get through as much of that as I can. The only other disclaimer that I will make here before getting into my material is I have my own limitations, both as a debater and even indeed as a sports debater. Most notably, most of my sports knowledge, sports interest, and sports spec has a decidedly North American bias and bent to it. There will be many useful examples from a more international context from numerous different places that I'm not going to be getting into today. But given that this is a CUSIT seminar, I wanted to ensure that I covered some knowledge that would also be useful for some of the major leagues that are played in North America. But to be frank, lots of debate tournaments, both here and abroad, can use more expansive knowledge from other kinds of sports leagues as well. But just giving that disclaimer, we can move on from there. So let's start right off of the top here. And if I accomplish nothing else, I wanted to make sure that I get this communicated, because for those of us who enjoy sports debates, this can be a little bit of a grievance that many of us have. And I'm just going to talk about the purpose of sports debates. And both as a judge and as a debater, if I had to describe what most often frustrates me about sports debates, whether this could be because of the motion itself, it could just be because of how a debate plays out, but it almost always comes down to this abstract idea of the spirit of sports. And frankly speaking, I think that in certain kinds of debates, when we don't have as much personal investment or as much interest in something, there can be a bit of a tendency to downplay the significance of that thing or suggest that it doesn't matter as much. And often, even when we are competitively incentivized to argue as if these things do matter, it comes out in the way that we're saying things that we don't really think it. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about this general idea of the spirit of sports. When you get into a debate round about like really important sports controversies that will have geopolitical or racial justice lenses involved in them, and then for some reason the only arguments that you're getting are about like what the spirit of competition is, I think that the genesis of why this ends up happening is that people, in some circumstances, some circumstances people just don't know the arguments, and that's totally reasonable. But in other circumstances, I think that there is a little bit of a lack of understanding about why it is that some people love sports, what it is that motivates them to care about it, and understanding that will probably make you a little bit of a better sports debater. So I'm going to go through 5 broad things under this section of what I think you could define as some of the purpose of sports. Some of these are going to be more relevant than others in terms of their debate applicability, but all of them have at least some relevance. So the first thing that has to be mentioned here, even if it's not necessarily ideal, is people often forget that sports is a multi-billion dollar industry. A multi-billion dollar industry, by the way, that not only benefits very, very wealthy people that own teams across the world, but also an industry that has a massive impact on its athletes and broader communities. If you take an example of when LeBron James left the Cleveland Cavaliers, the city of Cleveland suffered pretty significant economic losses. And I think it's kind of telling about the impact that sports can have in a number of ways in terms of economics, whether it's in communities or in relation to very specific people. Keeping that in mind is obviously fairly relevant. Second, we have its purpose in terms of entertainment. And the reason that sports is such a global phenomenon is because so many people make a habit of appointment viewing on live events because they want to be a part of something that's broader than themselves and they want to be entertained. It's also a pretty unique form of entertainment in the modern context because less and less things need to be enjoyed on a specific day or at a specific time, right? There isn't the sort of monoculture or appointment viewing that used to be the norm for television and movies as much as 20 years ago. And sports, and this is the reason why television networks are willing to pay so much for sports rights, even in an atmosphere where, at least in terms of sheer numbers, less people are watching them. One of the reasons that they're so valuable and the value is only increasing is because people feel that they need to be watching this in live time, right? There's something about seeing the event and watching it occur as it's actually happening that isn't replicated in a lot of other areas. And people get massive amounts of enjoyment and fulfillment from watching sports and participating in sports. Third, we have the notion of competition. And I do think that this gets a little bit overemphasized in some debates where there's probably much more important and impactful things going on, people center all of their arguments about how this is going to impact the competitive balance of a sport, and that matters. But the reason that I'm bringing up competition isn't so much because I want to get into a long discussion of how marginally changing the salary cap would impact the Toronto Raptors. That's not interesting to any of you, and it's unlikely to be interesting to many people in the context of a debate round. But it's important to keep in mind that sports provide an outlet for competition, both from the perspective of the spectator and from the athlete themselves, that is, in most circumstances, benign and doesn't involve as many harms as many other kinds of competitive activities. There are certainly problems with degrees of hyper competitiveness that we can get into in a little bit, but the core of lots of sports is this competitive drive, right? The idea that there is some kind of outcome that will be decided in a match or in a game or whatever. Next, we have community. And if anything, I think that this is underrated. Part of what drives people to do things like flock into the streets of Toronto and be around cheering with people that they've never met is the sense that they can be a part of something bigger than themselves that also has, at least in most circumstances, relatively little requirements, right? Lots of forms of community are heavily gate-kept, where you have to meet certain kinds of thresholds and certain kinds of requirements in order to be able to feel a part of that community. And in sports, you get some of that too, with like fan shaming of, well, I liked the Raptors when they had a purple dinosaur as their logo and that kind of silly stuff. But at least in compared to some kinds of community, it has a really high degree of acceptance in terms of being able to opt into it and join it without really having to justify yourself a whole heck of a lot. And there's all kinds of benefits that we can all accept come from community, even without thinking of it in a sports context, right? It's probably, I think, pretty telling that the only times that I can ever remember hugging a stranger or cheering at the top of my lungs about almost anything in my life have came in relation to sports events, right? This ability to express extreme joy and extreme sadness with an event that has some amount of distance, so I don't feel like my entire life has been destroyed if the outcome doesn't go my way. But I still feel close enough that when things go well, I can gain happiness and find some kind of meaning. And I think that this community and the enjoyment and belonging that community brings is a very underrated aspect of people's attachment to sport, particularly in a context where people might not feel that they have that sense of belonging in other aspects of their life, right? Given the amount of gatekeeping that can happen with all kinds of community. And the last thing, and this one is, I think I'm not going to spend as much time on, and again, I'm almost certainly missing some stuff here. The last thing that I would say is that there also is a essential recognition of excellence and merit, right? One thing that people appreciate about sports, and I think that this is pretty simplistic, but maybe this is more true in sports than in some other places. Again, I'm a little bit skeptical, but I should probably mention it. But this notion that in sport you can have a better determination of greatness and personal achievement and who it is that is really succeeded at something without having to worry about as many institutional barriers. This is where I think the argument begins to get weaker. But there are some reasons to believe that, at least in comparison to some other parts of life, this is a better outlet for people to both appreciate excellence, merit, and art, craft, however you want to consider this, while not having to worry potentially as much about some of the barriers that apply. I'll poke some holes in this theory a little bit later in the lecture, but let's leave it where it is for the moment. But this section really only answers kind of one question. And the question that this answers, all the things that I've just mentioned, is this basic idea of like, what is it that draws people to sports, and why is it that sports has meaning? Keeping in mind, right, that these things can mean very different things to different people. Also, there are important divisions depending on whether or not you are a spectator, whether or not you are a participant. And lots of the time when we have sports debates, especially general sports debates about like narrative and stuff, we forget that like massive amounts of kids spend long portions of their life involved in youth sports, and for some reason in sports debates that seems to never have as much relevance as what's going on at the professional level, which is probably important, but I would say, you know, symmetrically at best important to the massive impact that youth sports has on a number of individuals. But all the same, we can get a sense here of like the different things that draw people. Again, remembering that this will be different for different people in different circumstances. That being said, let's get to the second part of this lecture that I want to talk about, which is a pretty basic question of what is useful to know, right? Like if I'm going into a sports debate, what kinds of things do I need to know, or what kinds of things would it be helpful for me to know to be able to succeed in making arguments and not make a fool of myself, right? This would be, for some debaters, the apprehension that they feel going into a sports debate would have been similar to the apprehension that I felt going into lots of art debates when I was an undergrad. And I had this basic same question for lots of people about like, what are the basic things that I need to know about art motions? And it can be a bit of a difficult question to answer. And while I generally do tell people that spec knowledge is less useful than they assume for sports debates, in any kind of debate round, having knowledge is going to trump not having knowledge. That I'm not reinventing the wheel by saying that. I have 6 broad things I think can be useful for you to know going into a debate in relation to sports. And obviously this all keeps in mind that I can't just answer like, hey, we'll just watch every game of every major sports league and pay attention to sports media with every waking second that you have, because our time is all limited and we all have our own individual interests. It's probably not practical to ask that much of people. If you do that as a pastime, it's something that you can enjoy, but if you don't, that's probably a little much. The first thing that I think is useful to know is just like very basic information about the major leagues that are operating in your circuit, and like just the main ones, as well as basic info about, you know, the Olympics. I think FIFA, regardless of where you're from, having a little bit of an understanding of that is helpful, because any international tournament you go to, there will, if there's a sports debate, people are probably going to be making references to international soccer. But if you have a little bit of information about what the major sports are in the circuit that you are in, like, you know, how long is their season, like basic rules. I'm not even talking about super in-depth knowledge here, just basic cursory knowledge that can be certainly helpful. The second thing, and this is much more important in my opinion, a basic understanding of sports economics, because as we'll get to in our next section, lots of debates are sports econ debates, and they're much more about econ than they are about sports in a lot of circumstances. So basic questions like, what is a draft? What is a salary cap? What does ownership look like in major sports leagues? And are there different kinds of ownership? We'll get into some specific answers to some of that later on, but knowing those things, yeah, that'll be relatively important, because if you get debates that are specifically about those questions and you don't really know what a draft is, you don't really know what a salary cap is, and you don't really know what kind of ownership models exist in professional sports, you're potentially going to get yourself into a little bit of trouble. Third, I think it's broadly helpful to know about major sports controversies. This is stuff like whether or not we should pay college athletes, labor actions like lockouts and strikes, boycotts of the Olympics, geopolitics and like who should be able to hold the Olympics, performance enhancing drugs, these kinds of things. Some of these come up a little bit more now, and then like some of them have also died out. Like I haven't seen a performance enhancing drugs debate in quite a while. But having just a general sense of like what each of those terms is referring to, even if it's only so you can use it as an example in a debate that's about something broader, but that where knowledge of that might help you a little bit, can have certainly some helpful effects. Fourth, I think that having a basic understanding of the history of sports activism is also pretty helpful. We're going to get into some specific details about some of this in a little bit, but Colin Kaepernick, Muhammad Ali, Jesse Owens, Bill Russell and Jackie Robinson, Billie Jean King, Maya Moore, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I could keep on going in terms of listing names here, but particularly, I mean, right now, I would say if you're a debater and you don't know anything about Colin Kaepernick, that is almost certainly going to come back to haunt you in a sports round, frankly, other kinds of rounds too. And you owe it to yourself if you care about succeeding in those rounds to learn a little bit about that. I would also suggest that it's just something that's important to learn about outside of the context of whether or not you care about winning a debate round, but we'll save that for when we get to the specific section later on. Fifth, some basic ideas about sports stakeholders. What I mean here is that there are different stakeholders that are obviously impacted in any sports debate, almost regardless of what kind of sports debate you're having. This could be, athletes, fans, ownership, communities. Understanding some of the common ways that athletes are benefited and or harmed by major sports leagues, or how it is that communities reflect what happens within athletics and how communities can be shaped by athletics. There's lots of things in those departments that can end up being really helpful. And the last thing, and this is particularly relevant because I think that people talk about different leagues and different sports as if they are homogenous when they very much are not. League demographics and some specific distinctions between sports. What do I mean here? I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time explaining this because I don't have as much of it. I'm going to get to it a little bit later, but to be clear, it is not always the case that sports leagues are super diverse, even though they get broadly in sports debates credit for that being true. Some of the distinctions between leagues can really matter in terms of determining these kinds of things. So just to give you like a basic comparison here, there's a lot of discussion about why it is in North America that leagues like the NHL, right? So the National Hockey League are broadly less racially diverse than leagues like the National Basketball Association or the National Football League. And there are, like in any circumstance, numbers of factors that go into that. But one thing that I think that's worth remembering when you're trying to consider, well, why would this one league be less diverse, or like what are some of the structural reasons that something like that could occur? If you just think about it from a very basic standpoint, you can start to see why that might happen. So broadly, like a theory that is often posited for this distinction between hockey and the NHL and the NBA, just as a basic example here, is some of the core things that you need to have access to in order to be able to play the sport, right? So if you want to become a professional hockey player, if you want to play in AAA hockey or you want to do any of those things, you have to have access to not just equipment, which you would also require in almost any other sport. Those sports like basketball and soccer have less of an equipment requirement than, say, hockey or football. But it's also an issue of, is there an ice rink that I can go to where I can practice? Like how how much time do I actually get to do that? And these things end up becoming structural, because if you don't have access to something like this early on, a core skill like skating in hockey, if you aren't used to skating, then it doesn't necessarily matter what other like athletic gifts or abilities or hard work you might do if you have to start everything so late, right? Like there are barriers to entry that can exist in certain sports that can make it so that they are they don't necessarily reflect certain demographics in the same way. And then there's also some of this can also just come down to how these sports craft themselves. So golf and other sports that have been traditionally more, I don't want to, these things have changed and been different over time, but have had less representation in some part. In some situations, it's because those leagues or those courses or whatever, however you want to put it, have actively tried to ensure that that was maintained, right? So Augusta National only recently started allowing women to golf on their courses, and it was also notoriously slow when it came to segregation as well. So anyway, all those things end up being useful in terms of things that you should potentially know, things that can help you if you come into any of these kinds of sports debates. But I also think that it's useful to distinguish between the different kinds of rounds that you'll do if you do a sports round, because they're not all the same. And I think that sometimes sports motions get a bad rap for a very specific kind of sports motion, and it's useful to make some distinctions here. I have 4 distinctions. It is almost certainly not encompassing, but this is what I came up with. First section that I have are sports-centric. Second, sports econ. Third, sports social policy. Fourth, sports geopolitics. I considered adding another category here for like sports culture, but I think there's going to be overlap with all of these categories and places that you could say that I've missed out on, and you're almost certainly going to be right. But let's start with sports-centric debates, because I think that these are A, fairly rare, and B, where most of the bad reputation of sports debates comes from. And I can actually understand this, because if I had to debate something that was this technical in an area that I knew nothing about, I would be heavily frustrated as well. So the example of what I would consider a sports-centric debate is any debate where really what you are discussing in that round are the interests of a particular league, what is best for that particular sport, something that is highly focused on just the competitive dynamics of one individual activity. That's something that's sports-centric. And again, I actually think that these debates are fairly rare. The examples that I came up with, I haven't even seen a couple of these debates run in sometimes as much as like 7 or 8 years. One that used to be really, really frustrating, more as a Canadian parliamentary case that some people used to run, but I haven't seen in a great long time, is the eliminate offsides debate. You're not going to really be able to have any broader kind of impactful discussion about the impact of offsides beyond just how it impacts, whether it's hockey or soccer or whatever. It debates about reducing the length of a season, right? So whether or not it would be better to make a season shorter or longer. This is almost certainly only going to have impacts which are particular to that league and the players within that league and the fans of that league, rather than something that's a little bit broader. And then lastly, something like debates about tanking or load management. Tanking, I think you could maybe make a bit of a more explicit defense for, because there's some stuff about fairness and whatnot, but ultimately these debates are, again, somewhat sports-centric. This isn't me saying that these debates are like illegitimate or unfair or anything of that nature, but they do at least require a little bit of knowledge in order for you to be able to do them reasonably well. And being also honest here, I mean, lots of other kinds of CP cases require the same kinds of knowledge and don't really get questioned as much. But again, these sports-centric rounds do exist, and you probably would need a little bit of knowledge about the individual sports in order to be able to have a chance to debate those kinds of things. Let's get into the second one, sports econ. Now, the different kinds of motions that I wrapped in here, these are debates where, yeah, it's about a sports league or it's about athletes, but really the discussion that we're having is about broader economic impacts and consequences. And there may be some arguments related to competitive outcomes, but they aren't the only, or in some cases, even the most important arguments. And the list that I had here was debates about salary caps, debates about the draft, debates about fan ownership, about reducing salaries, and about college athletics. We're going to talk about college athletics near the end of the lecture, because I think there's some useful stuff to get in there. And it's also something that not a lot of people know about, and there's certainly a great deal of controversy around it. But really, these debates aren't just about competition. They're about basic questions of fairness. And sometimes that's balanced against competitive incentives, right? But when people make arguments against things like salary caps or the draft, they're usually doing so because there is a belief that there is something economically distorting or unfair about those kinds of systems. So the argument that people make against salary caps is a distributive one, right? The notion that a salary cap, by definition, lowers salaries for players because there's a limit to how much the owners of sports leagues or the sports franchises are going to have to spend on their players combined, right? And yeah, there are also some ancillary arguments about how that might impact league competition and these other kinds of things. But broadly speaking, this is a basic economic argument. If I was on Gov and I was on the side of banning salary caps, I don't know that I would even necessarily do a whole bunch of mentioning specific things about any particular franchise or particular players. I'd make a basic case for economic fairness. And there's also some elements of this about the distinction between how we see athletes because of the fact that they are largely in certain leagues, non-white, versus how we see people who are making lots of money in other kinds of leagues. But you get the idea here, right? Like, these are not debates that are just about competitive outcomes and what's going to make one team better or one team succeed more than another. And having all you would really need to know to be able to debate salary caps or the draft or ownership debates or college athletics is just pretty much what you could collect from the first couple paragraphs of a Wikipedia. Now, again, you're going to be at a pretty big advantage if you have lots and lots of knowledge, as is true in any kind of debate, but these debates are more about economics than they are just about competitive outcomes. Third, we have sports and social policy. And I think these debates are often almost not about competitiveness or the spirit of sports, whatever that means, at all. So these are questions of like media coverage in sports or sports quotas, a motion that used to be set all the time, may have even been set recently, were motions about implementing mandatory 50% coverage of men's and women's sports in major like sports media in North America. I don't remember the exact wording of the motion, but you get the idea here, right? And these debates, like if you're just gonna, frankly, if you start making arguments about competition in a round like this, the arguments that I've seen about competition and arguments in rounds like this get very, very quickly into deeply problematic territory. And these debates are more about the social and cultural impact that sports have, those kind of community dynamics that I referenced at the beginning of the seminar, than they are about who's going to win the next game. So those kinds of motions, it'll be useful for you to have some specific examples to tie to, so some knowledge about particular athletes or particular events or incidents that have happened previously to give some grounding to why it is that sports can matter and why it is that sports can have importance for people. But beyond that, you're not going to have to like regularly follow any particular league in order to be able to debate those well. In fact, I think that sometimes people who are super sports specky really mess those kinds of debates up because they start thinking that they can just insert arguments about the on-base percentage of some athlete when it really isn't that relevant. And then last, sports geopolitics. The most common sports geopolitics motions are obviously those related to the Olympics. So about whether or not there should be restrictions on which countries host the Olympics, debates from the perspective of countries, and whether or not it's in their interest to host the Olympics, and debates as well about like sports boycotts. This is just kind of the same motion that's been recycled and updated to like more recent contexts. Back in the day, it was boycott the Sochi Olympics. Then it became boycott Qatar, and then there's different versions of this motion that come back, and it's because it's responding to new scenarios with different controversies that have arisen that would potentially warrant or not warrant a boycott. And in these debates, it would be useful to have some knowledge about, for instance, from the perspective of debates about the Olympics, what it is that the Olympics stated goal is, the benefits of people enjoying the Olympics, but more importantly, you would need to know here the structural stuff, right? So what kinds of economic impacts does hosting the Olympics have on a specific country? Does this have any impact on their domestic policy? How does the country end up having to change things in order to be able to host it? These are things that are more related here than really any particular knowledge about a specific league or anything like that. So those are some of the different sports debates. And again, I tried to go through what it is that I think you need to know for doing each of them. But really, the main purpose of me going through that was just to basically say that only one of those categories will be the kind of debate where if you get it and you don't have any knowledge about sports, any knowledge is maybe a bit strong, but you don't have much knowledge about sports, where you'll just be totally doomed. And the other three categories, as long as you are clever, are listening, and you make an effort to try and find the impacts rather than just assuming it's a sports round so there are no impacts, then you'll probably be totally fine. Okay, moving on then to some other stuff here. So fourth, I want to talk briefly about where I think sports succeeds, some of the reasons, some of the things that it does that both adds value broadly, but that it gets credit for when people are making arguments in favor of it. And the first thing that is often mentioned, and there are, as with many of the things I'm going to talk about, a couple of holes in this, but one thing that is often brought up when people discuss the benefit of sports is the benefit of access and diversity. And this diversity question really should be kept in context, because it's about, there are some kinds of diversity that sports has traditionally done well with, and some kinds that it's done very, very, very poorly with, even in comparison to almost any other kind of field. But with that being said, it is the case that in major athletics, for instance, in professional athletics, that integration began happening in the highest levels of athletics before it did in some other circumstances. And in fact, there's lots of writing and research to suggest that there were signaling effects and cultural impacts of having integration in athletics that carried over to the rest of society, right? So when Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball, or we see instances, for instance, of Jesse Owens, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. They're the nature of sports wherein people are motivated competitively, both for better and for worse, does create incentives to overlook some things that otherwise people wouldn't overlook. And there's also, at least if we're talking about some sports, less barriers. But the main thing that I think is really useful, as we're going to get into when we get into some examples about athletes, is that one thing that sports does quite well is that it gives platforms to people who otherwise would be structurally prevented from being able to get said platforms. And this doesn't mean that sports is perfectly meritocratic and that if you reach the top of sports, that's just because you were the best at what you do. It's never that simple. But I do think that it is quite telling and quite relevant that many of the major voices, particularly if we're talking about in the civil rights movement outside of Martin Luther King and other specific activists involved in, for instance, the March on Washington that people can point to were athletes. And there's a couple reasons for that, right? The first reason for that is that the ability to become, in many different eras of American, North American, global history, the ability to become very wealthy and successful in lots of industries has not been accessible for all kinds of people. Whereas in sports, it has been more realistic, at least on a comparative basis. And that allowed for people to be able to get the kind of platform to say the things that they wanted to say, but also to be able to use their money in productive ways, right? And to use the power that they have to like reach some kind of change. Again, we're going to talk about some specific examples in my sixth section about some specific athletes and some information that's useful to have some knowledge about. But I do think that this is something that can be considered an area where sports succeed. The second area where I think that you can see that sports does succeed quite a bit is in these kind of community elements that I referenced early on. The notion that you can, and we're going to talk about where this community fails in a second, but the ability to have a sense of belonging and to be able to feel a part of something, as I mentioned before, is certainly profound. But let's also talk about where sports fails, because when people talk about access and diversity in sports, there's often a couple of things that are conveniently left out in these discussions. The first is that sports is, in some circumstances, although I don't even think that this is accurate, more racially diverse than lots of other workplaces, but it also really, really, really fails when it comes to gender representation. It is woefully falling short in this aspect. And I want to be very clear when I say this, because this has come up in some debates, and you'll hear people that'll bring up examples and they'll say, oh, well, hey, there's this, Serena Williams, or the WNBA exists. And these are examples of incredibly successful people that made it past many, many, many barriers. But it's worth remembering that if you're looking at the basic economic breakdown of who makes money in sports comparatively, you can't find a single workplace or a single other kind of cultural phenomenon where women are given less power, like positions of power, where women are put on television much. And I actually shouldn't say gender minorities in particular. There's just not access in the same way that there is in other places. Some of this comes down to toxic masculinity, because the notion that sports was this safe place for men and an avenue that was only supposed to be enjoyed by men. Like this idea that you have of locker room talk, right? When Donald Trump justifies the things that he says by referring to it as locker room talk, that language isn't accidental. That language suggests something. It suggests that this is something that would be acceptable in a locker room that would be acceptable nowhere else. But what does that mean, right? It means that in a locker room, this is a space not for, in that circumstance, women, right? This is a space not for women, and ergo, I can say these demeaning and terrible things about women, and it is acceptable because of the particular activity that we are doing. I think that phrase is not accidental in a lot of ways. And there's lots of manifestations of this, right? There's manifestations wherein if you want to enjoy sports as a spectator and you are not a cis man, you're going to get asked a lot of condescending questions that would not be asked to cis men that were watching it. Even just go on the Twitter feed of any non-cis man sports journalist and look into their mentions, and you'll see pretty quickly the kind of things that I'm talking about here. And again, part of the issue is some of the structural barriers that existed previously and the lack of catching up that has occurred from before. People will justify this in all kinds of ways, where they'll say things like, oh, well, the NBA is just better and more enjoyable and more competitive than the WNBA. And then those same people will watch college basketball and find no dissonance between the fact that they are able to enjoy college basketball and the National Basketball Association. But there's just something about the WNBA. I can't put my finger on it. I don't know what it is, but that's the kind of basketball that I just can't possibly watch. And the issue is part of this is just inertia, where people are used to the same kind of trends and then they keep them going in perpetuity. But there's a huge amount of, and I think anyone who's a sports fan would be kidding themselves if they didn't admit this, there's a huge degree of ingrained sexism that comes along with sports at every level, right? And this is something that sports fails at massively. And again, we don't even need to keep this just in terms of gender representation. If you want to get into representation of any other, like numerous other kinds, also fails. It's telling that there has not been a single active, openly queer NBA player, right? WNBA, there has been many, but in the NBA or in the NFL, I guess in the NFL, there was someone on a training camp, never made an actual roster. There are definitely people who will identify after they leave these leagues, but I think that in and of itself is somewhat telling that they don't feel comfortable doing it when they're actively playing. These are some suggestions of things that sports does not do nearly as well. And frankly, change has been quite slow. The fact that we still don't have many of these kinds of representation is fairly telling. And yeah, there are exceptions to this, right? There are the exceptions of people who are able to overcome these things, like Serena Williams, who can be widely regarded as probably one of the best tennis players ever, regardless of any kind of divisions that you would want to make. But in this circumstance, this is the exception that proves the rule, right? There is still massive ingrained sexism. There's also an issue here of commodification and dehumanization, right? Because as much as we might want to talk about how much we love that athletics has much more racial diversity, people view the role of athletes in a very specific way, and I think that they do it in part because of ingrained racism. And this gets to, the Laura Ingraham shut up and dribble stuff, or the notion that I can't possibly have politics with my sports. And a lot of what is being kind of said here under the surface is certain kinds of people are permitted to be political and certain kinds of people are not, right? It's not an accident that Laura Ingraham defends Drew Brees having an opinion on Black Lives Matter, but tells LeBron that he needs to shut up and dribble. This is explicit things, and it's not always just the easy scapegoat punching bags of Fox News talking heads that are engaging in this kind of stuff, right? It's broader societal trends, and there's this notion, and this is coming up right now in debates about whether or not sports leagues should return to play. But there's this question of it, do you view us as human beings, or do you view us as commodities for your own enjoyment, right? As if we're some kind of representation of just to be here to give you some type of entertainment. And a lot of the times the way that athletes are treated can suggest that it is just about entertainment. If you want to get into some examples of college athletics, things of that nature, at this point I might not get there, but all the same, there are huge issues that come with that. The last thing too is that community, as much as it can be a benefit, can also end up being a problem, because there's ways that nationalism and other things can seep into these communities, and you get instances where you have different kinds of clubs that have regional identities, not thinking that certain people belong, right? So controversies emerging over who should be on national teams, and certain players being treated markedly different because they aren't seen as fitting that national identity, and also issues of people covering things up for the purpose of protecting the franchise or the sports that they love. This happens in college football, where small town police forces are notorious for covering up rape claims made against high profile athletes because they're worried about and this is it's ludicrous even just to say, but it is what happens. They're worried about their prospects of being able to win a national championship, or being able to win next week's game against Penn State. And that sounds ridiculous because it is, but these things absolutely occur. So there's lots of areas where sports fails as well. Now, very briefly, because I realize, as I expected, that I am running out of time, I want to walk through a couple of examples that I think are useful to know about athletes that are worth looking into as examples that come up in debate rounds, but also just interesting individual examples that I personally find fascinating and have massive social impact. So let's start with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Many of you probably have some understanding of, maybe like recognize these names a little bit, but if you don't, Tommy Smith and John Carlos famously during the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, on the podium for gold and silver in their track event, raised their fists in solidarity with like Black liberation and movement politics, right? And there's two reasons why I think that this is an example that you should look into, and I'm not going to be able to give it the credit it's due right now. But the first reason that it's worth looking into is because, first of all, profound statement that speaks to some of the unique platform that sports has, the fact that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people see this and then have to reckon with what is going on in front of their eyes in a way that they wouldn't be forced to otherwise. But second, and this is the stuff that doesn't get talked about as much, right, is like the consequences that end up being faced to people who end up doing these things, right? These two end up not being able to participate in their sports and being shut out in major ways that replicate what we've seen with Colin Kaepernick in a more modern context. So that's a really important example. Bill Russell and Jackie Robinson, in terms of dealing with sports that were just integrating and the challenge of having to play and exist in spaces that were previously segregated and in many cases didn't really still want you there, but simultaneously using their voices to achieve like change. There's lots of things that can be said there. Muhammad Ali, anyone who has me as a friend on Facebook, probably I like 2 to 3 times a year will post an Ali quote, just because I think that both from just like a public speaking perspective, but also from a sports perspective, one of the more fascinating people that I've certainly ever seen on a television. But Muhammad Ali, famous for refusing to accept the draft into the Vietnam War, willing to go to jail if necessary and give up the heavyweight title in order to do so. And the last two ones that I'll mention certainly need to look into Colin Kaepernick. I'm not going to do a long breakdown of the Kaepernick situation now just because we're running out of time. But frankly, this is something that you probably should have looked into on your own. But the one that doesn't get enough attention that is thankfully getting more attention recently is Maya Moore, who took, in many ways, one of the more courageous stands in professional sports in recent years, but in part just because of the difference with which we treat female athletes in comparison to male athletes. This one only recently has begun getting the shine that it deserves. But Maya Moore was one of the best WNBA and college players in the history of basketball, and retired for the sole purpose of activism in relation to up to prison reform, right? And has done like incredible work in dealing with specific inmates and trying to pursue specific cases for justice that have been like really inspirational. Again, I have a list of numerous others. Billie Jean King, one that gets left out here. Battle of the Sexes in tennis is a great example. South African rugby gets brought up all the time as an example of consolidation and like the benefit of community building after massive trauma. Lots of examples of sports being really impactful. So I do have this last section here of controversies, college athletics, performance enhancing drugs, lockouts and strikes, and return to play. But given that I said that I would do under an hour and I haven't taken any questions yet, I should probably sum this up and begin letting people ask me questions, and I'll answer those for a little bit. As a note, the practice, the CUSID practice is taking place at 7:30 p.m. There's a link up at the top there that you can get access to. If you want to do some practice rounds or watch a practice round or anything of that nature, it'll probably be a sports motion. That's what I'm led to believe, which I guess makes a little bit of sense given the seminar that I just did. But if there are any questions, feel free, just type them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them in the remaining time that we have. Give it another minute or so in case anyone wants to ask anything. Thank you. I appreciate that. This has been a mess of a seminar, but I appreciate the support. Okay, so feel free to jump in with a question if you have one. I guess I'll just use the last 4 minutes to talk a little bit about the NCAA, because this is an example that I think a lot of debaters, when they learn a little bit about it, find pretty useful, both as general knowledge and in applying it to debate. So if you've ever heard anyone refer to a debate motion about whether or not we should pay college athletes, and certainly the first time that I heard it, because I'm not actually a person who's been a lifelong sports fan. I came into my sports fandom like when I was like 17 or 18. And okay, actually just got this question, so I'll come back to this in a second. Okay, so how would you tackle sports motions when you are unaware of the specifics of the sport that you are talking about? First thing that I'll say here is that it's pretty rare for a motion to be just about one league, and sometimes what debaters will do is that they'll hear whether it's the prime minister or someone like start only talking about one league or defining it in those terms. And feel free, by the way, to challenge that, because in a lot of debates it should be a bit more broad. But let's assume that you do get a motion where it's reasonable to define this in the context of one sport. So, this house opposes salary caps in the National Basketball Association. Try to think about the debate outside of the context of like, well, who are the teams in this league and like what important role do the players play, and think more generally, right? So if I was doing a debate about the NBA and salary caps and I didn't know anything about basketball, the way that I would look at it is like, okay, well, why is it that people care about basketball? What kind of impact would salary caps have on the earnings of the players and the earnings of the owners? And I would form my arguments from there. You don't really need to know the name of a single basketball player to make those kinds of arguments, and arguments about like who sports are supposed to serve, what it is that sports are trying to achieve, what the broad value of sports are. You can gain a little bit by having some specific examples, but you really don't need to reference specific athletes and specific teams. And you also shouldn't feel like ashamed that you don't know those things. Debaters have specific kinds of knowledges and don't have other kinds of knowledge. And lots of times debaters that aren't going to be able to name all 32 teams in the NBA off 30 or 32, I don't even remember, all the teams in the NBA off the top of their head, or it's not necessarily going to matter for the purposes of winning a specific debate round. So the biggest thing that I'd say here is that remember that except if the motion is not a properly designed motion, the debate almost certainly does not require you to be an expert on the specific sport. Because if the debate does require you to be an expert on the specific sport, it is a flawed motion. And by the way, that doesn't mean that you can get, like, if you got a motion which was something to the effect of, this house believes that all NFL players should refuse to play football until the league commits to blah, blah, blah. That motion could actually be debatable outside of the context of knowing a lot about the NFL. And if it isn't, then again, that's a flaw with the motion specifically. I hope that answered the question. I'm not entirely sure that it did, but try it as much as you can, figure out what the debate might be about just outside the specifics, and then go from there. Okay, another question. Anything else in the chat? Okay. I want to very, very briefly then on college athletics. The main reason that this debate about paying college athletes exists, for those of you who are unaware, is because, surprising particularly to many Canadians who aren't familiar with a situation where college athletics is this major media enterprise and one of the more popular sports in like the United States. College athletics are unique insofar as there are incredibly popular sports that only remunerate the colleges and the coaches, but not the athletes. There's obviously much more complexity to this, but there's been long-standing tension about whether or not it's acceptable that the way that the NCAA treats college athletes in a way that wouldn't be acceptable in almost any other workplace scenario or in any other circumstance. But I'm not doing credit to this because I only have like 2 minutes, and I just actually saw a question pop here. So I know that the practices start at 7:30. My guess is, just got the answer here. So 7:30 to 9. That makes sense. All right, last call for questions, and then I am going to finish things off. Again, thank you for all putting up with this very, very messy seminar. I hope that it helped at least a little bit. Okay, fantastic. Thank you all for having me, and enjoy the rest of the week. Enjoy the debates. Take care. Bye.